Here's one for you. We started by saying this class is an introduction to the Alter Rebbe. And this text is different than a textbook you might read on geometry or geography or a novel you might read, in that when I read a text in the West, I'm reading a book written by a person, and if I really like it, maybe one day I'll go to a book signing and meet the person, and there they are. I've met them, and this is their book. And I can learn about them, but it's their book, it's not them. In the kabbalistic tradition, we learned from the great masters that it's just the opposite. That in fact, if you meet the person, although that's wonderful and inspiring, and you get to see their face, and you may respond to that in various ways, in fact, you're not meeting who they really are. They said very clearly, if you want to meet who they really are, you need to learn their kabbalistic texts or their Hasidic texts, and that is the true person. And the body you see walking around and speaking and doing things in the world, that's more like an afterthought. That's a superficial level on who they are. So as we learn this text, keep in mind, at one level, we are actually encountering a great Kabbalistic master. And in fact, his intention in writing this was that we encounter them one-on-one as a private audience and get advice as to our soul path, and how we can learn to navigate, as we said, consciousness more masterfully. Then the Alter Rebbe starts the book with the text, Ki karov elecha hadavar me'od beficha ulvavcha la'asoto. This thing is very near to you in your, and you know, if you want to eat this, there's a blessing for wheat, which in fact is a very, very powerful way to eat. And so if you want to repeat after me, if you're interested, it goes Baruch, Ata, Adonai, Eloheinu, Melech, Haolam, Borei, Minei, Mizonot. I wouldn't say no. I'd say no.
Happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
Happy birthday to you.
Nice.
Happy birthday, dear Happy birthday to you.
Thank you. And a birthday, although it was a few days ago, is also an opportunity to give blessings in Judaism. So I blessed each of you with deep insights into this text over the coming year, and may it enlighten every aspect of your being. You're welcome. So may the thing be close to you, in your mouth and in your heart to do it. And we said, hold on, doing all the Torah, doing all the mitzvahs, really, that's close? That's an easy thing? And to do it in your heart with joy? How is that possible? And this whole book, in many ways, is an answer to that question. All right, then we start with chapter 1. Let's do a little quiz, see how much you remember. Chapter 1, the soul is given an oath before it comes into a body, a two-part oath. Who can remember without looking down at their text? What is that oath? Anybody? The oath is to try and be a tzaddik, and don't be a, right? But even if the whole world says that you're a tzaddik, what should you see yourself as? Russia. No, not a Benoni, not a Benoni. That's a Russia. Right? So this, the oath we start off says in the Talmud, before a soul comes down, try and be a tzaddik, and don't be a rasha. And even if the whole world says you're a tzaddik, think of yourself all the time as a rasha. And then the Alter Rebbe raises a big problem, which is elsewhere we're told, don't look yourself as a rasha. So which is true? Which am I supposed to use as my primary posture for how I see myself? Right? Big question. And he raises other questions. If I look at myself as a rasha, won't I be upset? And aren't I commanded to serve God with joy? Another big question. And then he expands the definition of a rasha and a tzaddik to let us understand the conversation better. And what are our 5 categories of people? Who can name them, remember them? Anybody?
A complete rasha. A complete tzaddik.
Complete tzaddik? Incomplete tzaddik? Benoni.
Complete rasha.
Complete rasha?
Incomplete rasha.
Incomplete rasha. Right? And also the other set, a tzaddik who good is to him, or who knows good, a tzaddik who knows bad, etc. So, but 5 main types, and we just talked about different ways of looking at it. Leave it with the 5 main types. And then we started to define what is a Rasha? And it seems that a Rasha is not at all a wicked, diabolical person, but in fact, a Rasha goes higher and higher levels of seemingly righteous person who's still a Rasha. Someone who has only done one sin is still a Rasha, even though every other action was productive. Someone who does just a rabbinic prohibition, still a Rasha. Someone who does everything right, but one of my friends is doing something wrong and I'm in a position to guide them or help them and I don't. Now I'm a Rasha again, right? And then even higher, somebody who gets everything right and who helps all their community around them in every way possible, but there was a half an hour that year where they could have studied Torah and instead they played a card game. Still a Rasha. So I could work my whole life and not get close to the level of this Rasha, right? A Rasha is not a wicked person. In fact, a Rasha can be a very, very, very lofty soul who spends all their time working on improving themselves and trying and helping others. Still a Rasha. And that leaves us with the question, what's a tzaddik? And B, what could a Beinoni possibly be? And that's the focus of our text, is to find out what a Beinoni is, because that is the vehicle that we're going to use. That's the model that we'll aim towards. And finally, he says, to understand, you have to understand that a tzaddik is not just about doing everything correctly, but a tzaddik has voided their heart within them. As King David said, I voided my heart within me, him through fasting. You could do it other ways. And so it's not simply that a tzaddik does everything right behaviorally. It's also that that place where that behavior might come from, potentially, has been transformed, emptied out, and made void. So the place where the behavior could come from, the potential for behavior in the heart, has been made void. It's empty. And that's not this mystical idea. That's that place where the ideas pop into my consciousness. I'm walking down the street and I see someone's house and I think, boy, that's a great house. I'd love to daydream about that house and how great it would be to live in. Well, Judaism says that is a counterproductive thing to think about or talk about or act on. And so I take that impulse and I just leave it aside. But that place where the impulses come from, oh, I'd like to tell that person, what I think of them. That place that for most of us is full of really wise ideas, so to speak, has become empty, transformed, and is void. So a tzaddik needs no inhibition because they never get an impulse that is counterproductive. Every impulse is now productive. So whereas a Rasha is determined by their behavior, anything that they do that is counterproductive makes them a Rasha. What defines a tzaddik is not simply that the behavior has been corrected, but that the potential behavior, that source where those impulses come from, has been transformed. There's nothing left there. And he goes into, just in case we thought a tzaddik and a Rasha were half and half, and a Beinoni is right in the middle. Sorry, tzaddik is more good deeds, a Rasha has more bad deeds, and a Beinoni is half and half. He says that's just a borrowed term. But to truly understand, and here's where the discussion of what is a Rasha, Beinoni, and tzaddik ends, and the beginning of developing the idea of the Beinoni begins. He says to understand, we have to understand what Rabbi Chaim Vital wrote, that every Jew possesses two souls. Two souls, right? So not a single soul, but two souls. And so we're at page 45. For anyone watching on the video, we'll start at page 45 in our text of the Tanya, this beautiful new edition. Lessons in Tanya. Now, does anyone have this model that I gave out in the first class? I don't know if you're bringing that back. If not, I have some spare copies here. You pass around and take one. So when the Alter Rebbe says there are two souls, what are we talking about by a soul? What is a soul? Oh, yeah. Go the other way. And if you're like me and you picture a soul, you kind of picture what? What would you see in your mind when I say, what's a soul? Spirit, okay, it's a general term, yeah. What do you see? Do you see a visual image, an auditory image? What do you see when you picture a soul? So, yeah?
Life force full of energy. That's what I think of as a soul.
Exactly, a life force full of energy. So there might be a sphere of light or a uniform area of light. It's full of energy. Energy flows out of it. It's a source. Some people think of it as a single deep point within somehow. But all of these ideas tend to be simple, tend to be uniform. That a soul is a shape of light or a point within or something like that. And that may come from living in a wider non-Jewish society. But whatever the reason, in Judaism, there's quite a different structure of what a soul is. And it's defined not by simplicity, but by complexity. A soul is a very, very complex being. In fact, a dazzlingly complex being. And when we look at the body and how complex the body is, that is only a reflection of the complexity of the soul. The reason the body is so complex is because it needs a vessel to receive each aspect of the soul, and so the body's complexity is a reflection of the soul's complexity. It's that multi-layered, it has that many organs and functions, it has that many aspects. So for the purpose of our class, this is a nice beginning model for a soul. And of course, when we say these things, when we talk about structure, please keep in mind time and space are only connected to the soul down here, right? So all this structure that we look at, whether it's circles or a umbilical cord, how tall it is, nothing to do with space. This is not a physical model. This is just something to get our heads around the abstract, complex being that a soul is. But we label my teacher who drew this or presented it could have presented it in any direction with any shapes. The shape doesn't matter. However, the structure of a soul is one end of it connects with us here in what we call time, space, and consciousness, or the lowest level of creation. So the world that you and I tend to walk around in, which is made up of space and time and consciousness, the soul connects with it down here, and then flows up like an umbilical cord through 4 levels of spiritual worlds. 4 various spiritual worlds. At the very top, it is actually a spark, and it emerges out of the Ein Sof, which is called the infinite light. Ein Sof means without, Sof means end. Ein Sof is the kabbalistic term for God. Not even infinite light, I misspoke, just infinity, right? Not the light that flows out of it, but the Ein Sof itself. So this is a very simple diagram of a model for the soul that will become more and more complex as we go into the structure of the soul. But very important to understand the tools and the details of the model that we're working with as a soul. Like for instance, if I don't know, can you hold this up in front of the camera, make sure they get anybody watching gets a picture of it? Ta-da! Maybe close up. Yeah, thanks, Danelle. For instance, if I go and I use, what's the Microsoft Office called? It's a term for the whole, the software that comes from Microsoft for an office. Call it Microsoft Office. If I open it up, I don't use a lot of those programs. The ones that I do use, I kind of learned by trial and error. I type, I have a problem, I figure it out. Does this button work? I ask someone, how do you do this? So I have kind of a, happy-go-lucky kind of working knowledge of maybe Word and maybe a little bit of Excel. Thank God we have office assistants who are professionals in this matter and who have gone and learned each of the programs in the Microsoft Office software and can open them up and know the lower functions, the higher functions, how to do fancy formatting, whether in Excel or in Word, how to do those crazy equations on the top of Excel where things are adding up. How does it work? I don't know, right? So the way I use Microsoft Office, maybe it works for me to get by, but it certainly is not showing a level of mastery. The way they use it, they have access to much higher functions, and they can really deal with a much wider array of problems as they arise. Same thing with the soul. The soul has many, many levels, many programs that are flowing all at the same time, and those programs have many, many lower and higher level functions. And if we want to be able to manage the issues that arise in life more masterfully, it may be helpful to learn about the different levels of the soul, the different functions, and the ways that we can apply them to our story here in time, space, and consciousness. Does that make sense? Yeah? So we're going to start with this model of the soul, and it'll become more complex as we go on, as we add pieces that we learn from the Tanya. And in fact, what he's saying is we have 2 of these. We have 2 different beings that are flowing up from this moment in time, space, and consciousness, and flowing all the way up to their source. And the two of them are kind of fighting it out inside us, which is a good thing to know and explains why there's so much tension within most people. As we said, sometimes I know what the right thing is, but I can't seem to get myself to do it. Sometimes I resolve to do something, but the next day I wake up and do just the opposite. Sometimes I open up my mouth and say things, and then I wonder, what immature person said that? So how is it that I'm always me, but sometimes I do things that I barely recognize? If we understand, first of all, that we have two souls, that begins to open up the problem and the solution to the problem. And we're only going to learn about the first soul in this chapter, and then the second soul, the Nefesh Elokit, in the next several chapters. But just to introduce them in brief, Nefesh Ba'amit is called the animal soul. And that's the soul that comes in first as a baby. That's the soul that is egotistical. That's a soul that's interested in survival of the self. So this is not a bad thing. If we did not have a Nefesh Ba'amit, we'd sit and we wouldn't bother eating, and we wouldn't bother going out and having a job, and we wouldn't bother building a home, and we'd sit and we'd meditate on wonderful, deep concepts, but would not do anything about them. Nefesh Ba'amit is the driving force behind how the body does any activity at all, and how the body survives, which it needs to. So we don't see Nefesh Ba'amit as being bad, and even evil is an incorrect translation as we've looked at. It really is egotistical, a self-centered drive, and it goes in this direction. Whereas Nefesh Elokit, the second soul, that is other-centered. It's interesting primarily in extending, contributing, helping others, and also interested in losing itself in the Ein Sof. Right? Whereas Nefesh Ba'amit wants to maintain who I am, Nefesh Elokit actually wants to return to its source, where there's only the Ein Sof, and it's not even there. It never was. Because if you have an infinite light that's truly infinite, indivisible, there's no room for any other being. The infinite is everything, not light, an infinity. So there's a struggle between the two souls, one that wants to extend, help other people, and even rise up and dissolve itself in the Ein Sof. And the other, Nefesh Ba'amit, that wants to continue its own existence, strengthen its own existence, and guard itself. And the two are always arguing and fighting over what's the correct choice, what's the correct path. And as we'll learn, only one functions at any given moment. So every word that each of us says, every thought that we have, any action that we do, it's either one or the other of these souls that's doing it. And learning which soul is functioning when, and how they should flow, and how they should work together is a deep key to manifesting yourself in life and fulfilling your purpose. Any questions about that? That's a big introduction to the soul. Good stuff. So we're on page 45. Let's start right at the top. Shehein shtei nefashot. Go ahead.
These are two nafshot, two souls and life forces.
So we have two souls, nefesh achad mitzad klipa v'sitra achra.
One soul originates in the klipa and sitra achera.
Achra, good. Klipa means shell.
Klipa means a shell or peel. God created forces which conceal the godly life force found in all creation, as a peel covers and conceals fruit. Sitra achara means the other side, the side of creation that is the antithesis of holiness and purity. The two terms are generally synonymous.
As we said, this is the section of the Tanya, of our User's Guide to the Soul, that is more informational and not procedural. So we're learning about the various aspects of the soul, the structure of the soul. We're including some terminology that we'll need. And then in later chapters, we're going to start to learn how to put them into play, what to do about it, how to organize all of our being in a more masterful way. So these are two terms that are important for us to know, klipa and sitra achra. Page 45, yes. Klipa literally means shell, or peel, or husk. And sitra achra means the other side, the opposite side, the other side. So in some sense, they're used as synonyms, in that the world is seen, according to Judaism, as being either holiness, which is something that is unified with God, something that recognizes it is being created by God, something that recognizes it wants to fulfill its purpose according to that framework, and something that in one way or another nullifies itself to that sense of the Ein Sof of infinity. Right? So it's not about me. Right? If it's not about me, if it's about God, now I'm moving towards that side of holiness. And if I can be completely gone and say, I'm only here to take care of my kids, I'm only here to contribute to the world around me, I'm only here to pray or do good things or learn, and the sense of me is gone, now I've risen higher and I'm more part of that side of holiness. And Sitra Achra is simply the other side. So in creation, in existence, there's the side of holiness, and then there's just all other stuff, all the other side. And the way you read the name tells us that, in fact, the only thing that matters, according to Kabbalah, is the infinite. There really only is one being here. There's no other people here. There's no other being here. There's no other creation here. Even though it looks to my physical eyes like there's many of us, Kabbalah says there's only one being here. And everything that's outside of that really has no real existence. Right? It's an other side. We don't even give it a name because its only definition is that it's not in the side of holiness, it's the other side. Right? It has no content at all. So Sitra Achra talks about the side of holiness and then the contrast, the other side of existence, which is everything else that's not nullified, that thinks it has existence, that thinks it is a pen or a table or a Michael. Yeah? So which one?
Yeah,
Oh, yes, we do. Here. Here's the whole packet. If anyone needs, pass these around. Oh, you're welcome. Sorry I didn't notice that. And then klipa, we're on page 45. Klipa means shell or husk. And klipa shows us that when we look at anything in the world, the first thing we see is the superficial level, the outside. But what do we know about a shell? Can I eat a shell? Usually not, right? What do I have to do with the shell to get use of it?
You gotta open it.
Crack it open, right? So the only point of a shell is I'm going to open it up and get what's inside. And the thing that's inside, whether it's a nut or the flesh of a fruit, that is the thing that is valuable, that is nourishing. And yeah, the shell protects it and covers it and hides it, but at some point, the only point of the shell is to be discarded, to be destroyed, to have itself removed so that what it was protecting, now that it's come to fruition, can be enjoyed, made useful. And the world is like that too. When we look at the world, if you're like me, you basically see the superficial level, you see the physical form, the physical substance. You notice time flowing by, you don't see what's creating time. I notice basic consciousness. I'm not aware of the higher levels of my soul that are creating that consciousness. Each of those aspects is a shell, is a cover. And Kabbalah is about recognizing that the shell is to be discarded, as it were, and that you're supposed to eat what's inside, what's behind it, what's being enclosed in it, what's contained in it. So while they're synonymous, there is a distinction in that, on the one hand, Sitra Achra talks about contrast, that one aspect of the universe is holiness and the other aspect is the other side, and that basically it's just one or the other. Whereas Klipa talks about a relationship, right? Really, when you talk about Sitra Achra, the other side has no relationship to holiness. It thinks it's there, so it's cut itself off from oneness, as it were. But a shell has a relationship with what's inside. It's protecting it, it's hiding it, it's in relation, and it needs to be removed in order to access it. So in fact, Klipa talks a little bit about the relationship between the different aspects of the universe, whereas Sitra Achra is just about contrast. So this soul that we're talking about, the animal soul, it actually originates in the Klipa and the Sitra Achra. It flows out of the other side of existence, and that's why its whole modus operandi is about me. That's its programming. That's what's intended to do, is to focus on me, that I survive, and that I am here in existence, even to the extent that I may think I exist on my own and no one's creating me, I have no source, right? It can even go that far. That's all it does. והיא המתלבשת בדם האדם לחיות הגוף.
Is this nefesh which originates in the klipa and sitra anara that is clothed in the blood of a human being giving life to the body?
So if you want an address for where nefesh b'amit enters into the body, enlivens the body, the Alter Rebbe says it comes in through the blood and it is enclosed in our blood. Right? You know, take it or not take it. We have a more modern scientific view of the body, but certainly the blood is a source of life. When we lose our blood, that's a bad thing. Blood oxygenates. It does all kinds of things we don't quite understand yet. It has an incredible complexity. And it's in the blood that nefesh b'amit flows into existence. Uchdichtiv ki nefesh habasar b'dam hi.
As it is written, in the nefesh of the flesh, for example, a nefesh that sustains physical and corporal life is in the flesh.
And he gives us a quote from Leviticus. And he used a word here I want you to pay attention to, and that is enclosed. Right? He says, Hamitlabeshet bedam hadam, it is enclosed in the blood. And this is another key concept. Enclothement is something that we'll want to understand. It's how higher functions tend to represent within lower functions. Right? So the nefesh b'amit is enclosed in the blood. On the one hand, you could think of it as I put clothing on, and now the clothing is moving around simply because I'm moving around. What's animating my shirt? It's the fact that I'm wearing it. I'm inside it. So same thing with a physical body. The animation, the life that's in any physical body, it comes from nefesh b'amit. That is the being that is moving the body around and enlivening it. But you can also understand it in terms of, say, thought and speech, which may illuminate it slightly more. We can see easily that it is thought that is enclothing itself in speech. Right? I'm talking now, and the sounds coming out of my vocal apparatus are trying to represent perhaps a point in the intellect or a thought. And so that thought is enclothing itself in these sounds and the speech and the language. And I could describe the same point one way or another way, or I could talk about it more, or perhaps less is a good idea for me. But in any case, I'm enclothing that point. Thank you. I'm enclothing that point with speech. And what is speech doing to that thought? On the one hand, it's expressing it and allowing other people to know what I'm thinking. Because if I'm just sitting here not speaking, unless you're a very special person, you don't know what I'm thinking. On the other hand, it's concealing the thought. Because when you hear the words, I'm hearing the language and I'm creating my own thoughts, but I'm not really perceiving what their thought is. I'm just remapping the model. So even though I'm hearing language that is allowing thought to be manifest, it's also concealing the thought. Same thing with blood and the nefesh b'amit. We just see physical blood. We might think there's no soul there. There's nothing going on. It's just a physiological phenomenon because the blood is enclothing nefesh b'amit. And that means, first of all, I can see what nefesh b'amit is doing. It's enlivening me. But B, it's also concealing nefesh b'amit. And I could spend 8 years in medical school and do all kinds of dissections and surgeries and never see that there's a soul there, just physical blood. So that's the very important idea of enclothement, which we'll revisit many times. Mimena ba'ot kol hamidot ra'ot me'arba yesodot ra'im sheba.
From this page stands out equal characteristics derived from four evil elements within it. Just as the four physical elements are fire, air, water, earth, are the foundations of physical entities, so too is the nefesh comprised of four corresponding spiritual elements since they derive from
Klipa.
evil, they sometimes evil from them in turn, or evil
All right, so now we're going to enter into just a little side conversation about how the four elements play into this. It's another aspect of the structure of the soul. Does anyone have a watch I could put on the table to I could keep track of halfway? Okay. So we're not going to go thanks. We're not going to go into great detail about the elements, but in terms of this being a user's guide for the soul, if I bought, say, a boat, or if someone gave me a boat, it'd be good to know what material elements that boat was made of, wouldn't it? Because what could a boat be made of generally?
Wood,
Wood. What else?
metal,
Metal. What else? Fiberglass.
plastic.
Right. And what are the types of boats you might have if you had a thin fiberglass delicate boat? What kind of boat might that be? Sailboat. Right.
Little rowboat.
Or the sculling boats, the very delicate, maybe very fast, very agile, right? So if I have a boat made of thin fiberglass, I probably don't want to take it fishing on a rocky river, right? Now, if I had a rowboat made of sturdy aluminum, what would that be useful for?
Take it out on the river.
Yeah, bang it around, put my kids in it, doesn't matter. A little dent doesn't make a difference, right? If it's made of beautiful, polished, handcrafted wood, what is that going to tell me? Don't do that, right? And this might be a beautiful canoe for an expert person to go
Get on a
trekking in.
quiet lake.
Exactly, yeah. You don't want to scratch it, but it probably has beautiful uses. If it's made out of military, some crazy military compound with 2-foot walls, what does that tell me about my craft?
Beat it to death.
Or
Go up on the rocks.
sail it into the Pacific and just project power, whatever you want to do, right? So knowing what materials my craft is made of tells me what it's for, how I should and how I shouldn't use it, and lets me understand what my purpose is in writing that craft, right? Same thing with the soul. A soul is made up of 4 spiritual elements: earth, air, water, and fire. And each of us has a proclivity towards one of those. And generally, if I'm a soul that has a lot of fire, it's going to mean I can be useful in one way, and I might be not useful in another way. If I have a soul that is predominantly water, that makes me more useful in one way and less in another. Every soul is made up of 4, but it's good to know the material components of the soul that we're learning about to learn how to best use it. And 4 elements. דהיינו כעם וגאווה מסוד האש בנגבה למעלה.
Namely, anger and pride emanate from the element of fire, which rises upward. Once ignited by anger and pride, a man, like fire, soars aloft. Pride is the state of considering oneself superior to others. Anger, too, is an offshoot of pride. Would a person not be proud, he would not be angered when someone defies his will.
Right, so now we're talking about nefesh b'amit. And so generally when the elements start running through nefesh b'amit, that's when we get into trouble in the world, where nefesh b'amit is running the show. And then the element of fire can become pride and become anger. And the way fire rises upward of its own, once it starts, it kind of feeds itself and the heat shoots it upwards on its own. Anger tends to be the same, or pride. If I'm a prideful person, then my pride will make me more prideful. Most emotions, when you have them, they kind of run out. If I'm sad and I have a good cry, I'm less sad. But if I'm angry and I have a good temper tantrum, it just kind of makes me more angry, doesn't it? It feeds itself. However, it can also, as an aside, run through nefesh elokit, and that can create a passion for doing good things. So that is a productive use of the element of fire. ותאוות התענוגים מסוד המים כי המים צמיחים כל מיני תענוג.
The appetite for pleasures emanates from the element of water. The water promotes the growth of all kinds of pleasurable things. The ability of water to make pleasurable things grow indicates that concealed within it is the element of pleasure. Thus, the appetite for pleasure derives from the element of water.
Right, so when we look at the world, and we look at what water creates, everything that we love, beautiful fruits, lush pastures, wonderful animals, if you eat those, very tasty things. Water is required to create beautiful flowers. Anything you might enjoy, water feeds it and causes it to be luxurious and inviting. So water is seen as the element that, for nefesh b'amit, creates a lust for pleasure. Not higher order pleasure, but simple earthly pleasures, enjoying a meal, whatever. However, if we're flowing through nefesh elokit, now it becomes a sense of higher order pleasure, of love, and of generous contribution. So water can go either way. It's an element of the soul, and as we learn how to navigate our 2 souls, we learn how to channel these elements. And in fact, when I see, I'm running into trouble here now with just overdoing it with something, I'm eating so much chocolate, whatever it may be, that's water flowing through the animal soul. So what I need is to focus on re-energizing water through nefesh elokit, And now I know if I energize love and giving and contribution and generosity, that's going to somehow take the energy out of this drive for chocolate that I'm experiencing. So knowing the details of how each element flows through each soul can actually be a useful tool going forward when we get to application.
But you're keeping water in one element. What about ice and what about steam?
Yeah, I haven't read anything. We could be creative and say, you know, if maybe anger turns water into steam. He doesn't really develop this very deeply, so that's outside of my knowledge. But I'm sure you could find texts on that, and there's a whole rich world in there if you're curious. I'm not aware of it. V'holelut v'leitzanut v'hitparut udvarim betelim misod haruach.
Frivolity and scoffing, boasting, and idle talk emanate from the element of air. Like air, they lack substance.
Then the element of air, if you've ever met someone or if you found yourself simply talking about nothing, joking, gossiping, whatever it may be, that's kind of energy that is, so to speak, full of air, full of hot air, an airhead, whatever you want to call it. We have English expressions that represent it too, and that is air flowing through nefesh b'amit. Right? That is the element of communication and thought flowing simply in a self-centered way without any higher order purpose. Ve'atzlut ve'atzvut misod ha'afar.
And sloth and melancholy emanate from the elements of earth. Earth is characterized by heaviness. A man encumbered by sloth and melancholy likewise senses the heaviness of the limbs.
Right, so the last element of earth, of our four elements, when nefesh b'amit starts to really allow earth to flow vigorously, that means now I'm kind of weighed down, I'm depressed, I can't really face things, I don't have the energy to deal with things. That's one of the trickiest aspects. If we find ourselves in just a sort of depressed kind of, I don't have energy to even complain, that's earth flowing through nefesh b'amit. Whereas when it flows through nefesh elokit, that truly gives us a sense of accepting the responsibility of being a soul in reality in a purposeful way. Traditionally, you would call it ol malchut, the yoke of accepting that I'm connected to God, right? And that yoke allows me to really plow the earth in a productive way and to take this strength and energy and keep moving forward no matter what my feelings may be, right? So 4 different aspects of how we can use the elements, whether it's flowing through the higher or the egotistical soul. And here's an interesting piece that's about, we really perceive, in this tradition, we perceive Jews almost as a species. Yeah, and that we have certain characteristics like certain animals are quick, and certain animals can jump, and certain animals can swim beautifully. That the Jew is in fact, I know it's strange, but the Jew is in fact has characteristics that are just natural to us, part of our spiritual makeup. And this is a quick aside on that. וגם מידות טובות שבטבע כל ישראל בתולדותם, כמו רחמנות וגמילות חסדים באות ממנה.
From this soul stems also the good traits inherent in every Jew's character, such as compassion and benevolence. But since this nefesh of kalipa and evil, how do good characteristics come from it? This matter is now addressed.
Right, so this may be novel to us, but tradition says that in fact, there's 3 just characteristic aspects of any Jewish person that are just there, like as part of our personality makeup as Jews. That we're compassionate, that we're bashful, and that we're charitable. Right? And bashful, actually, we learned at Sinai. We're not naturally bashful, if you're wondering. We're said naturally to be brazen, but at Sinai we became bashful, and that stuck with us. But compassionate and charitable, those are 2 that, in fact, if a Jewish person doesn't show those attributes, traditionally you actually had reason to look into their lineage and see if maybe they were or weren't Jewish. Yeah?
Okay, got compassion and benevolence, which is charity, and what was the third?
So embarrassed in front of the truth, bashful.
I thought that it wasn't, I guess it just wasn't making sense.
No, I see what you. Yeah, we've met a lot of Jews that aren't quite bashful, but so that's not one. That's not one that is our natural trait. That's one that's more when we connect to our spiritual tradition, then it brings that out. because it really stems from our encounter with God at Sinai. That transformed us. But compassionate and charitable, that's something, it's not necessarily from working with myself or growing spiritually or connecting with Kabbalah or coming to the temple and praying. That's just what I like to do, right? I mean, if there's a charity, I open the envelope, I don't think, oh no, another charity, now I'm going to have to put somewhere my money that I could use for a pinball machine, now I have to give it to orphans. No, if you're like me, you open it, like, oh, let me see who I can help. There's a part of me that just likes it naturally, not that I have to sit down and meditate and learn Musar and get myself to like it. Jews just tend to be involved in charities. We like charities. We like helping people. We have a taste for it, right? Doesn't make us super evolved spiritual masters. It's just a characteristic of who we are. That's what we're told by our tradition. And same thing with compassion, right? If you look at how Jewish communities tend to act, we tend to set up all kinds of organizations to help people that are out of funds, that are out of food. We do it all over. That's just how we function. Not because necessarily we're all evolved masters of our tradition. That's just our nature. We don't like to see someone who is having a bad time in life, and we actually like to help them. That's still a self-centered activity. We do it because it's who we are. We like it, right? Not because we become other-centered, but it's just a tendency. It's in our DNA, very much. So why is that? How is it that if our nefesh bamit comes from the klipa, how is it that we have these natural tendencies for kindness and for charity? Ki b'Yisrael nefesh zo de klipa hi mi klipat noga sheyesh bo gam ken tov.
For in the case of the Jew, this soul of klipa is derived from the klipa called noga, which also contains good, and the good within this nefesh gives rise to these positive natural traits.
Right, so we'll get into it later, but klipa also has structure. There's actually 3 completely separate shells, and then there's klipa noga, which is a shell that has some light in it, mixed into it, that is able to be extracted. So that klipa noga is called the luminescent klipa or the translucent klipa, because the 3 impure klipot, they actually do have a little bit of light in them, but we can't get it out in our Jewish tradition. It's like earth that might have aluminum in it that you can't extract easily, whereas other elements might have not much more aluminum, but it's easy to extract. So we get those and we get our aluminum from it. Same thing with light that's in creation. In the Jewish pathway, the little bit of light that is here in the world that's there for us to elevate is in that aspect of klipa called klipa noga, and is that klipa that the Jewish soul flows out of. And is that klipa we're interacting with when you make a blessing on some food, when you raise a cup of wine, when you shake a lulav. All those physical things are flowing out of this klipa noga. And that's why they're presenting themselves as having energy that we can elevate. And we'll get into that too as a pathway later. V'hi misodetz hadat tov v'ra.
From the esoteric tree of knowledge is comprised of good and evil.
Oh, okay. That we could do a course on that line. Right? So remember the Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And before they ate from that tree, there was capacity for good and evil in the world, but it didn't enter into them as a duality. Right? They were clear, and that's because they had no sense of ego. They had no sense of I. And to sin, you generally need to have a sense of I, right? Ooh, I'm embarrassed about this. I want to tell a lie to hide it. Right? Oh, I like that. I like that watch. Maybe I could take it and bring it home. If there's no I, if there's no me there yet, then it's very hard for sin to enter into me. Once they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, now the dichotomy became inside. Now there's a me, and there's a me who can do right and wrong. And out of that tree, the whole klipa noga flows out, which is where productive and counterproductive energy is all mixed together in the cosmos. Yeah? We won't go too deep on that one, but that's the source of klipa noga. So in the last 10 minutes, I want to look at, I think when I started, I said we'd encounter a few bumps as Reformed Jews learning this very spiritual text. And now we've gotten to probably the biggest speed bump in the book, and that is the next 3 sentences. So before I read them, let me just give you a little, a little sense of how to approach these. And one strategy that people take is to simply teach the Tanya going from idea to idea and not to really get into these moments. And I fully respect that. I think there's a purpose for that. However, in my experience, I've seen this book as a user's guide for the soul. I've seen it have too deep an impact on people. I've seen it really change and elevate people. And I've seen it be really a technique to organize one's soul and consciousness and actions throughout a life, higher and higher, going spiritually higher and higher in a spiraling effect. And I wouldn't want to introduce people to the Tanya and then have them, once they really absorbed it deeply and put it into place, maybe 3 years later be reading and see this text, which as progressive Jews, if you're like me, it really rubs me difficultly, if that's a word. Right? So I don't want to take that approach. I'd like to go through and learn every line. And before we talk about it, let's just say this isn't the main thesis of the Tanya. And if like me, you kind of just, your opinion is you disagree with this, you can still benefit from the spiritual pathway of the Tanya without necessarily agreeing with these 3 lines. So that's our caveat. Let's read it through and then we'll discuss it. מה שאין כן נפשות אומות העולם הן משאר קליפות טמאות שאין בהן טוב כלל.
The souls of the nations of the world, however, emanate from the other unclean Kelpot, which contains no good whatsoever.
כמו שכתוב בעץ חיים שער מ"ט פרק ג' וכל טיבו דאבדין האומות לגרמייהו אבדין. Sure.
As it is written in Etz Chaim, Portal 49, Chapter 3, that all the good that the nations do is done out of selfish motives.
Right, so we'll retranslate that in a moment. Since their nefesh emanates from klipot, which contain no good, it follows any good done is for a selfish motive. And one last, uvechitita b'gemara pasuk v'chesed l'umot chatat, shekol tzedakah v'chesed she'umot ha'olam osin, enan ela lehityaher chulu.
So the Gemara comments on the verse, the kindness of the nations is sin, that all the charity and kindness done by the nations of the world is only for their self-glorification. When a Jew acts in a benevolent manner, he is motivated mainly out of concern for the welfare of his fellow. The proof of this is that were his fellow not to need his help, this would give him greater pleasure than the gratification derived from his act of kindness.
And concerning?
What is that word?
We can't read the
Oh,
word.
concerning the nations of the
You can't
world.
read it, it's
Yeah.
staple. Concerning the nations of the world, however, this is not so. Their motivation is not the welfare of their fellow, rather it stems from a self-serving motive, the desire for self-glorification, a feeling of gratification, and the like. It should be noted that among the nations of the world, there are also to be found those whose souls are derived from Klipat Noga, called the pious ones of the nations of the world. These righteous individuals are benevolent, not out of selfish motives, but out of a genuine concern for their fellow.
All right, so now there's a lot here. If you're okay, I'd like to go over 5 minutes today. If you need to leave, obviously, that's good. But I want to look at this piece more carefully, right? And keep in mind what we said in the past about words like ra, evil, and selfish, right? That the English translations don't necessarily get at what the Hebrew is saying, and that's one of the issues at play here. So there's 3 frameworks that I use to try and relate to this in a way that makes sense as a Reformed Jew, as a progressive Jew, as a North American. So certainly in our community, we have many non-Jews that are loving members of our community, that are kind, spiritual people, that are generous people, and hard to see how this applies to them in any way, right? And also in the wider world, we see non-Jewish nations doing many wonderful things. Hard to see how this has any truth in it. So one strategy that I like to use is, first of all, he's simply quoting other sources here, right? So if you look at what he's saying, he's quoting Eitz Chaim, which is a traditional book by Chaim Vital, kabbalistic. He's quoting the Gemara. And so everything that he's saying, he's simply referencing traditional Jewish sources. And so the same way I may have an issue with something written in the Torah, and I think most people in this room would have issues with some things written in the Torah. Noreen could certainly quote several moments for us. We still love the Torah, we kiss the Torah, we teach our children to read the Torah. We somehow find a way to relate to the Torah, even though there are parts of it that we certainly disagree with in our opinion personality, to our core perhaps. Right? So same thing here. If I can love the Torah and if I can have the Talmud here at Temple Israel in our library, despite some of the things that here he's quoting from the Talmud and that the Torah says, so for me, I can include this book in that, and whatever way I deal with that dissonance with the Torah, I can deal with it too, because he's simply quoting the Torah and the Gemara. He's not giving his own his own opinion that he's quoting here as a source. So one is to deflect it to the sources, and we all know as Reformed Jews we have a way of connecting to texts, even though there may be things that really disconnect for us in the text. Second, I think perhaps the most useful is to understand the spiritual context, especially in terms of Hebrew language and what it means. And that although this was intentionally translated with quite strong language, and we're told that they actually went to the last master of the tradition to ask him, should we water it down? Should we couch it in better language? Should we make it a little easier on the ears for American Jews? And he said, no, that'll look like we're hiding something. You should translate it exactly how you think. It can be best expressed in English, and we don't want to look like there's something that we're ashamed of in this text, and people will learn the Hebrew and understand the deeper meaning. So one issue is how we translate ra, evil. And as we said, ra is not evil. A rasha, a person, is not an evil person who's out to harm people. A rasha is also a very, very spiritual, noble, helpful, other-centered person who has simply done one tiny piece where there's an element of egotistical drive still contained. Yeah? So we're talking about very, very subtle levels of self-centered drive that still remain within otherwise very, very good behaviors. So a person could be a complete saint in their behavior. They could be a really internationally known person for their efforts to help people around them, dedicate themselves totally. But the question is there still some very, very subtle aspect of self-centered drive? So Yossi Jacobson, who teaches this, gives an example where he says, and I think I shared this in the first class, if I walk by someone who's homeless and hungry and doesn't look well, and they say, hey, I'm hungry, can you help me out? I may walk by them and I can't stand to see them so hungry and in such pain, and so I go and buy them a sandwich and I give it to them and I help them out. And I walk on and I feel like I've done a good thing, and I have. I've done a good thing. I'm a good person. Yeah? But if I look back at my thought process, what did I say in my mind? I couldn't stand to see a person suffering that way. I couldn't stand to see it. So even though I did a beautiful, wonderful thing, I did the right thing, and selfish only in the most literal terms. Not like selfish, brutish, coarse, emotional, just there was some aspect of me in there. There was some part of me that said, I'm doing this because it bothers me that someone suffers, and so I want to alleviate that feeling of being bothered. Now I give them a sandwich, now I feel better. Doesn't make the thing wrong, the thing is beautiful and right, but the question is, can I do the right thing and have absolutely no flutter, no fumes left in the tank that have any self-centered wisps about them? Right? So the normal thing to do is to help people and give them a sandwich, and just there's a little bit of me in there. I like doing that. I want to be charitable. I gave Temple a big donation. I'd like to have my name somewhere. That's a good thing, right? Why wouldn't I? That is normal humanity. That is just natural and normal. That's who we are as a species. To be able to do the right thing and at every level of the subconscious, even the most subtlest way, eradicate any possibility of there being an egotistical element in there. To say, I'm going to give this charity, I'm going to give this charity, and not because I feel good about it, not because I feel bad about the people I'm helping, not because I want any attention, not even in the most subtle way, that is almost a superhuman feat. And so he's not saying that the rest of the world, in fact, is bad or evil, as this translation may imply. What he's saying is the world is normal, and the majority of Jews are normal also, and do many good things, and the world does beautiful things and has great spiritual, generous people. But the ability to do the right thing with absolutely no residue of self-centered drive whatsoever, to be completely nullified, that is an almost superhuman feat, and one which in this tradition is connected to the Jewish soul pathway. Yeah? Now you may say, okay, that doesn't look like what he's really saying, and I'll buy that. If you don't like this framework, I get it. But truly, when you read the book and when you learn, you'll see that what he's talking about how a tzaddik or even a Beinoni functions, is really an extraordinary stance. And then the third way that I like to look at this is also of context. And so, if we can cast our minds back to 1797, when this was edited, when this was put out, there was no state of Israel, right? There were no great democratic nations. We're sort of the end of the French Revolution here. There's no democracies who perceive themselves as going out and helping the world and as protecting the world order and being there for good. They just had the Khmelnytsky massacres at the beginning of that century, and Jewish history was simply a litany of finding a place to live because we served the ruling empire, and then at best being thrown out when we stopped serving them or being massacred. And it seemed like it was one of those after another. That was all that happened. The Jewish homeland had been destroyed. There was nowhere safe to go. You were always reliant on the ruling forces. And how did empires function? They expanded, and if they had the power to take over more land, they did, and they subjugated countries, and they operated according to their interests. This was not a controversial thing to say. This was how the world always worked. If you were in a Polish state and the Polish landowner owned that land, they had power over you to do whatever they wanted. There were no other rules, and they could tax you, and they could toss you out of your land. That was simply how the world functioned. So from the macro, from how empires functioned, how kingships functioned, how the world functioned, to the micro, their relationship with the individual people in their region, to the historical, the slaughters that they'd endured, and the sense that the only way to really survive amongst the wider world is to become useful to them, because then they will treat you well because you're useful. It's very hard for me to try and look back and put my mind in that mindset and see that perhaps what he's saying here, even in its most extreme form, was not such a controversial thing to say to those Jews. That was just reality. And the creation of the state of Israel and the rise of the great democratic nations who say, freedom for everyone practice their own religion, we're here to try and go out and protect people and help people in our own definition, that has changed the Jewish psyche so radically that for us to look back at this and say, well, how could he say this? Of course non-Jews are good. Of course, there's countries that are helpful. Of course there's people that are helpful. Look at us. Look at how people connect, and look at the beautiful things that come out of the non-Jewish world. It's impossible for me to look and see what the context was where he wrote this. And in fact, it seems to me it's almost, he's quoting what was the obvious to them, that the world functions according to its own interests, ultimately. Even when they're being nice, it's because you were helpful to them, for the most part. And that he's simply using it to back up the structure of the soul here, saying, look at how the world works. That's because of this spiritual structure and where they're flowing out of. They're flowing out of the klipa, which isn't able to be 100% without any flutter other-centered. There's always some self-centered drive. And on top of it, of course, there's the sense of the righteous of the nations, where this isn't a blanket statement. Even amongst non-Jews from the traditional perspective, there are seen to be people who are like a tzaddik, who do flow with a completely other-centered drive, and whose souls do come out of klipa noga. So he's really talking about generalizations and not exclusive. Just as a Jew with a lifetime of work can rise up to become completely other-centered, so can a non-Jew, even from this perspective. And if none of those go down nicely for you, which I understand, because here we are in a Reformed temple, and this is tricky stuff to look at, please know that this is just a little detour. It is not in any way central to the things we're going to learn, and even if none of my frames seem to create a nice way to relate to these three sentences, please know that we can get great benefit out of the technique, even if for us, we say, you know what? I disagree with these 3 lines. Yeah.